during the ANC's elective conference there, Party Secretary General Fikile Mbalula bashed Western Cape Premier Alan Winde for having talks with the U.S. about the African Growth Opportunities Act, that's AGOA. Now, Mbalula said that relations with the United States need to be strengthened and normalized. We'll get you a sense of what he said in his own words. But of course, it sparked all kinds of debates, this visit by Alan Winde, and whether or not a line has been crossed here. Let's try and make sense of it for you now. Bring in senior researcher with the Trade Collective. That's Ms. Lebohang Pheko, who joins us via our telephone line this morning. Great to have you on the program as always. Thanks very much indeed for your time. And, you know, many people, I think, are two minds about this. I mean, on the one hand, let's face it, the Western Cape is still a province in the Republic of South Africa. South Africa has official communication around where they stand about this. However, on the other hand, Alan Winde, as an autonomous political leader in the Western Cape, I suppose, according to some people, has a right to have discussions with whoever he wants to. Is there a line to be drawn, do you reckon?
So I think that, you know, there are a few things that, I mean, alliances are really about political and, you know, the political moment. And the interesting thing about this is that in the whole, there's a conflation between economic interest and political interest very clearly and very transparently. And the AGOA agreement actually allows for this. So I think there are a couple of things to note. And the one is that the AGOA agreement is not actually an agreement, yeah? It's a U.S. trade policy which was developed because it was seen that it was viewed that the aid package that had been in place under Bill Clinton was not sufficiently meeting the U.S.'s poverty eradication strategy. And it has to be said, their strategy and their interests, not the interests of African countries. So it's extremely one-sided. It is a unilateral program, not a bilateral one. And the thing is with this is that it has, with that being said, it also means that it has the discretion. At any moment, the U.S. can remove and can, cancel or unfriend, potential economic partners. So, for example, Mali, the Gambia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Zimbabwe, and so forth have all at different times been in the sin bin, and many of them still are. And a country cannot even negotiate or appeal their removal from the AGOA preferential treatment. The second piece of that is that it also has a very stringent dispute resolution mechanism, which is a U.S. trade remedy. And in fact, we are in the middle of an interesting case right now. South African exporters of lemon juice have received a notice of complaint because of a group of California citrus producers, Ventura Coastal, petitioned the U.S. Department complaining of dumping of South African products. Can you imagine that? Wow. On their territory? But I think that the weaponizing of AGOA has long been in dispute, and it has also been viewed as something that is really more a U.S. vanity project and their way of corralling their own economic interests rather than being a partnership. And this is where we need to appreciate that it behaves like this because it is not a partnership. It was not bilaterally negotiated.
Sure. I suppose that will then again bring to the surface those questions about whether or not South Africa is actually better off being outside of this particular unilateral arrangement as you describe it.
Well, this is the thing. So on the face of it, Ayanda, we have to also bear in mind that we out of the potential that we could have exported to the U.S., for example, out of the 15 billion potential that we could have exported, we've actually only utilized about $2.7 billion US. I probably shouldn't say only, but I think that, it does illustrate that in the scheme of things. I mean, by 2021, our exports were about could have been 15.7 billion. To the U.S., but only about 2.7 billion, I should say, met the criteria for AGOA's zero duty policy, including some metals and some mineral exports, which are not eligible under AGOA. And as we know, that is a huge part of our competitive advantage is our mineral exports. So we don't actually export our gold, our platinum, and the things that really are income generators for our economy under the AGOA agreement. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is an opportunity for us to be completely dismissive in terms of, just basic economic relations, economic diplomacy and political diplomacy. That probably would not be the approach, but I am suggesting that in the scheme of things, the AGOA agreement is not as detrimental as it might be. That said, nor is Russia. Russia only accounts for about 1.3 of global goods, and they hardly, our imports and exports to them are hardly about in the realm of about $282 million. So in the scheme of things, certainly Russia is not even as important an economic player. But this is where I'm saying that we're having a conflated conversation between economic and political interests.
Yeah. But let's face it, sometimes those two issues do intersect, right? And perhaps the question we should be asking is this one of those moments, the weaponizing of these different agreements for political ends?
It certainly is, Ayanda. I think, there are a couple of things that we could deduce from this. We could certainly say that we have a right to have our own sovereignty in terms of who our allies are. And I think Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor has been very explicit on this and quite radical, in fact, in this regard. And I think as a country, we've also been quite clear that this is a really important moment to understand and institutionalize what it means to be part of a formation like BRICS, whether our loyalties are then invested in Russia and China and India and Brazil to the exclusion of perhaps formations like the United States, formations like the European Union, for example, particularly during this very sensitive geopolitical moment. It's also actually an opportunity for us to rethink what our external interests are and who our external allies are. We all know that there are no there are no permanent friends and enemies, but we also understand that the vagaries of international power and internationalization, as it were, in, trying to build different forms of global community, appreciating that, of course, many of these texts have been set by the European Union and by the United States overwhelmingly. It is an opportunity for us to practice some kind of multipolarism, e.g., devolving power away from that set script of being in alliance with the United States. And I think if traditionally the U.S. have not been an ally of the of South Africa. They were not per se an ally during the apartheid regime. They were not per se an ally during, they haven't shown us any great allegiance. And I think it's important for us, not only South Africa, but as African nations, to go back to our origins of non-alignment, which was very important during the period of the Cold War, where we refused to get caught up in the skirmishes between the United States and the former Soviet Union. We should really remember history and not be very careful not to go back into that same loop, particularly because there are greater stakes of this interconnectedness between political and economic and financial interests, even aid interests and so forth.
Yeah, as we battle these geopolitical dynamics, there are also real domestic political machinations that really kind of make things a whole lot more interesting. The Western Cape has been run by the DA for quite some time, and that's presented an interesting dynamic for the governing ANC, because I suppose Alan Winde felt emboldened to go and negotiate for whatever interest he felt he'd be able to secure for the Western Cape as a separate body from the governing party. But again, one can't help but wonder whether or not those receiving him in the U.S. see him as the separate entity or consider him to be a representative of the country from which he comes.
And I find that an incredibly fascinating and also a divisive strategy. So, their stance has been that towards Russia has been that, they don't want it to impact imports and exports particularly the Western Cape, and especially the very important Western Cape agricultural sector and aquaculture, the marine economy, which is very key in that region. However, I think it's important to decide here whether or not Cape Town and the Western Cape views itself as part of a broader nation state, or, as you say, some sort of a federated entity. And I'm trying to understand under which legal standing a province, a provincial body, is able to negotiate on a national platform and negotiate bilaterally not so much on behalf of the country, but as a separate entity and almost as a separate jurisdictional entity as well. I think that it also presents problems for the notion of a collective shared national policy on international relations, on our military policy. I think that it potentially sends quite a confusing message to the United States. I mean, granted that the Western Cape has exported 28 more times more edible fruits to the Russian Federation than it exports to the Ukraine, for example. And I think that and there are different trade statistics around this. I mean, it's been agriculture products accounted for 3.2 billion of South Africa's exports to Russia, and only about 120 million of those went to the Ukraine. So I can appreciate in a way why they would want to protect their interests, but those are their interests. Those are not national interests.
Absolutely. Always so interesting and complex. Ms. Lebohang Pheko, thanks for helping us connect the dots from your vantage point at least. Lebohang Pheko is a senior research fellow with the Trade Collective.